Hello and welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue, where we take a look at great power plays in the South Caucasus and the region's strategic importance for America's foreign policy. And a particularly warm welcome to those of you who are joining us today from the region. I know we have a global audience joining us today. My name is Amy McKinnon. I'm a national security reporter with Foreign Policy, and it is my pleasure to be your host this morning. The South Caucasus is a vital linchpin for Eurasian security and investment and a complicated battleground for great power competition. After decades of Western investment in development, security, and democracy promotion, Washington and Brussels have been losing influence in the region. All the while, geostrategic meddling by Russia, China, and increasingly Turkey have destabilized the region, exacerbating simmering conflicts and ethnic tensions, while redirecting political and trade relationships. Our program today brings together top officials and leading issue experts to explore the role of the South Caucasus in America's foreign policy. As the Biden administration seeks to repair diplomatic ties and strengthen US global leadership, what main challenges and opportunities does it face in the region? How can the United States prevent further democratic backsliding and foster deeper economic engagement? These are just some of the crucial questions that we will examine this morning, and thank you all for tuning in. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to our partner, the America-Georgia Economic Cooperation Foundation, for helping us make this event today possible. Now on to some brief housekeeping before we welcome our guests. Just to let you know how you can ask questions today, we want to hear from you, our audience. We have hundreds of people tuned in here on Zoom, as well as watching our live streams on social media. We've reserved a portion of this event for questions from our global audience, and here's how you can write us. If you're on Zoom, click the Q&A button at the bottom and submit your questions. Be sure to tell us your name, your organization, and where you are writing from. If you're joining us on the phone or watching the live stream, you can email us your questions. The email address is events@foreignpolicy.com. Of course, we encourage you to chime in on social media with all of your thoughts and questions and interests. Please be sure to use the hashtag #CaucasusPowerPlay. All right, so with all that, let's get started. I'm now delighted to start our program with a perspective from the State Department's Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. I'd like to welcome to our virtual stage our first speaker, the Deputy Assistant Secretary, Erika Olsen. Erika Olsen is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State overseeing policy for Southern Europe and the Caucasus. She previously served as Director for Regional Political Military Affairs in Europe, guiding US participation at NATO and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. From 2019 to 2021, she directed the Office of Northern Europe, the Baltics, and Arctic Security. Welcome, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Olsen.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here today. I hope you all can hear me okay.
Loud and clear. Thank you for joining us. We're delighted to have you here. So you recently took on the South Caucasus as part of your portfolio of responsibilities, and you wasted no time getting over there. You were in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. I think it was the beginning of November. Could you just, with this trip fresh in your mind, could you just share some of your takeaways and your highlights from that trip to the region?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also want to say at the top, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be here today with a fantastic group of panelists, real experts in the region. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. As you noted, we have increasingly been asked to become more engaged in the South Caucasus region, and newly appointed into my role, it was very important for me to get to the region quickly, to have conversations with our close partners and friends, and to understand more what they were looking for in terms of deeper engagement from the United States. And what we could do in that space. And maybe I'll start a little bit, if I could, with talking about where our South Caucasus policy is within the government, and how that reflected on my goals in the larger region. And as you know, the region has faced significant instability over the last year, and we have very much tried to be a steady and engaged partner with the countries of the South Caucasus, and that we really strive to help the countries of the region find long-term peace, stability, democracy, and prosperity. We absolutely support greater democratic security and economic resiliency, both at the regional level and in our broader bilateral relationship. Our overall approach is a regional one that aims to foster peaceful settlement of existing conflicts and enable opportunities for the 3 South Caucasus countries to cooperate and achieve positive outcomes together. We want to strengthen our long-standing relationships and increase engagement in the region, as I said, at the request of our partners there. I think it's important we strongly support Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia's efforts to build this regional relationship independently and in the best interests of the countries of the South Caucasus themselves. One of the things that I made clear in all 3 capitals while I was there is the role that the United States wants to play in a transparent fashion of being an honest broker to bring the countries together to have these conversations themselves. We, of course, continue to strongly support the sovereignty of all 3 Caucasus countries. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan all deserve the opportunity to chart their own path without interference from outside foreign powers. And the end of Soviet domination allowed each of the countries the space to pursue their own self-interests. And there's no greater supporter for South Caucasus independence than the United States. We also are trying to find ways to economically connect the region, because it's very much in the interest of broader integration, lasting peace, and does indeed create a more prosperous future for all the countries there. We envision this as something that we can work together closely on, both the government and the private sector. And one of my priorities is offering that commercial assistance and support to U.S. companies who are interested in investing further or getting involved in the region. And in that note, I would like to just highlight a couple of really positive examples from our private sector and how that's helped strengthen our cooperation in the South Caucasus. Coca-Cola Azerbaijan won the Secretary's Award for Corporate Excellence for their work in empowering Azerbaijani women to scale up business and lead in local communities. Just last month, a Silicon Valley company launched a venture fund in Georgia of up to $50 million, which aims to help high growth potential technology and innovation companies in Georgia attract more US and foreign investors. And while in Armenia, I had a chance to meet with really some of the leading companies in innovation technology. One American company, Fortune 500 company, Synopsys, is not only Armenia's largest IT employer, but it's partnered with universities to develop the next generation of tech talent. So we're really trying to focus on kind of broadly deepening our relationship in all of the different spheres, and strengthening the relationship between the American people and the people of the region. I also, for a takeaway from my trip, is I think for us, the importance of continuing to engage in multilateral institution efforts. Of course, the OSCE, the Minsk Group co-chairs format, has a very important role to play, but that also extends to working within the UN, NATO, and of course, together with the European Union. Our efforts are really bilateral as well as multilateral, and we see those bilateral engagements as a way to spur forward momentum in some of the multilateral institutions. Maybe a few other takeaways from the trip. Personal relationships matter, and dialogue is incredibly important. There's a lot of distrust to overcome and a lot of disinformation out there. I think there are a lot of external players who have their own goals and outcomes for the region that don't always run in parallel to those countries of the South Caucasus. And that what we've found is real breakthroughs, of course, happen when people and leaders throughout society sit down across from each other and have conversations, or maybe sadly in today's world across the screen, but it's really that conversation that is so important. I applaud Georgia's efforts to bring the countries of the South Caucasus together for these conversations. I was also very, very happy that the US could play a role in bringing the foreign minister of Azerbaijan and Armenia together on the edges of the UN General Assembly in September, the first time that had happened since the cessation of violence, and within the context and the auspices of the Minsk Group co-chairs. So maybe I'll stop there. I can talk a little bit about kind of the relationship with the individual countries, if that's helpful, but I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much for that fantastic overview of the administration's approach to the region. As this is the week of the Summit for Democracy, one of the concerns we've heard a lot about from the South Caucasus is democratic backsliding, and particularly in the context of Georgia, which was, as you well know, once the real kind of regional poster child for democratic transformation in the region. What specific policies are you looking to pursue to support democracy in the region, in Georgia in particular?
Mm-hmm. Well, while I was in Georgia, and as many of you might know, I served at our embassy there from 2016 to, oh, I'm sorry, from, I'm losing my time, 2008 to 2011. I have a very special place in my heart for Georgia, as I think you do as well, Amy, from your time there. I was really reminded when I was there of the strong, enduring partnership between the people of Georgia and the United States, but also of the importance of continued work on democratic development and the rule of law. And we continue to strongly support Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. And as a close partner, we want to help them enact the type of judicial and electoral reforms that they themselves have decided are important for the future of the country. And we are worried that actions, government actions, have eroded some of that democratic process. And so the ruling party that has committed to judicial and electoral reforms, and we really want to see follow through on those commitments. We are lucky to have a very strong ambassador in Tbilisi, who is very much leading us there on the ground in terms of our engagement with the government. We are very happy to welcome President Zurabishvili to the Summit for Democracies this week, as you noted, and look forward to seeing the pledges and plans of action that Georgia brings forward as it looks into the next year. I think we will continue to engage very strongly. I think, as you've seen, deliver tough messages when it's necessary. I think that's important, an important part of friendships, something that we ourselves benefit from some of our partners. So we will continue to do that as well.
And going back to your earlier remarks, I mean, you underscored the importance of multilateral organizations. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about, what you're hoping to do to kind of reinvigorate the role of the OSCE Minsk Group, and by extension, the role of the US and Europe in mediating disputes between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Sure. I feel like we've already had a little bit of success in that over the last few months. I think getting both the Azerbaijani and the Armenian foreign ministers to the table for discussions, including one-on-one discussions, I think has at least opened up a greater understanding between the two sides of where each other is when it comes to addressing some of these challenging issues that remain. I think that the meeting in New York was a great starting point. I think that the meeting that the Minsk Group co-chairs were able to facilitate in Paris on the edge of the UNESCO discussions was also very important in that. We were disappointed that last week on the edges of the OSCE ministerial in Stockholm, the planned meeting of the foreign ministers didn't happen. But I think we're optimistic that in the very near term we will see some additional discussions. I think bilaterally we see our engagement as a way to bring those countries who play a role in the Minsk group to the table to really engage. I think we have seen over the last year and a half a lot more efforts by some of them to work bilaterally in ways that while were very important to getting to ceasefire, have maybe not moved the progress forward of addressing some of these most contentious and honestly most dangerous issues when it comes to the potential for future violence. So we hope that our increased engagement in the Minsk Group co-chairs format, our increased bilateral engagement will help move forward on finding solutions, helping the sides, helping the region find solutions in this space. Secretary Blinken, when he was in Stockholm for the OSCE ministerial, had a chance to meet with both Armenian Foreign Minister Mirzoyan and Azerbaijani Foreign Minister Bayramov for very good and open discussions. My boss, Assistant Secretary Karen Donfried, has already had multiple conversations with the ministers. And I think that also has helped encourage engagement within the Minsk Group co-chairs format. I mean, as we all know, it's not going to be easy. There are a lot of issues to resolve. But I think as long as we're continuing to have conversations about those issues in an honest, transparent way, where Armenia and Azerbaijan and Georgia as well can talk to each other directly, then I think we'll move towards progress.
So we only have a couple more minutes left in the segment, and you've been extremely generous with your time today. But could you mentioned at the beginning that during your visits to the region that partners made some requests for further U.S. engagement. Could you just give us a sense of in what areas? Is that economic engagement? Is that support with peace process? What kind of engagement are they looking for?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it did differ a little bit, I think, from capital to capital. I mean, one thing that I did hear in all three capitals was an interest for more regional coordination. And I think that's something that the United States can very much bring to the table. So we are now looking at what can we be doing more when it comes to some of those key issues that cut across all three countries. So trade, as you mentioned, I think is an important one. I think infrastructure, how to help with communications and transportation routes that bring the region closer together instead of pulling them further apart. I think from an Armenia perspective, I think there's a lot more that we can do together to help them as they continue to move forward on Prime Minister Pashinyan's reform agenda, particularly the changes that they've made, really impactful changes in the judiciary and in advancing rule of law. I think in Azerbaijan, an important conversation we had was the future of energy in the region, and really with the pandemic, I think we haven't necessarily appreciated just what's been done in the southern energy corridor, and what more we can do together. Had some very interesting conversations there about green energy, about innovation, how we could tap into the expertise of the Azerbaijanis to bring that green energy and innovation into the southern energy corridor. So I think there's more we can do there. I think in Georgia, it's really helping support their Euro-Atlantic integration. I think it is, as we talked about, helping them reach the potential that they've laid out for themselves in terms of the future of their democracy. but also continuing to strengthen those ties between Europe and the United States and Georgia and the greater region.
Thank you so much. And with that, we're going to move on to our next section, but thank you so much for joining us, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Erica Olson. That was a fantastic stage setter and a preview of the Biden administration's policy for the region. So let's take a deeper dive now into the local dynamics on the ground across the South Caucasus and their interplay with the broader great power rivalry and what that all means for security, economic and political development for the region. I'm pleased to be joined by Jason Bruder of the University of St. Andrews Institute for the Middle East, Central Asia and Caucasus Studies, Ambassador John Herbst, Senior Director for the Eurasia Center with the Atlantic Council, and Thomas de Waal, Senior Fellow at Carnegie Europe. Welcome to our virtual stage, to our panelists. You can now turn your cameras on and unmute yourselves. And as a reminder to our audience watching at home, please do submit your questions for this panel using the Q&A box here on Zoom or through the email address. And don't forget to chime in on Twitter using our hashtag. So welcome to our guests. I'm hoping, as we have a very international audience today, I'm hoping, Thomas, you can set the scene. Give us the 10,000-foot view. Who are the major power players in the region, first of all, and what are their interests in the South Caucasus?
Well, first of all, thank you, Amy, and thank you to Foreign Policy for organizing this discussion. It's great to see the number of participants being almost 400 down below. So that does show the huge interest in this quite small region, which has obviously traditionally been at the at the crossroads between north and south and east and west, and still is. And I think what we're seeing is the three traditional great power empires, which are neighbors, which are Russia, Turkey, and Iran, still being, incredibly important players. But obviously now that these three countries are sovereign over the last 30 years, we're seeing the interests of the United States, of Europe, both individual countries and the EU, and increasingly, and in different ways, of China in the region. So it makes for a very crowded interest in this region. And I think, it would be a mistake to say that anyone, including Russia, has a dominant influence here. And something that I've said in my 25 plus years studying this region, there is also the phenomenon of the tail wagging the dog that these three countries do themselves. The local dynamics are incredibly important. And so to take the case of the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict a year ago, which is obviously a great tragedy, 7,000 lives lost, completely shifted the political landscape of the region, created opportunities for some displaced people from the 90s to return home, but also created new Armenian displaced people. To take that conflict, I think no single outside power, including Russia, was able to influence that conflict. Armenia, it's basically an Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict. And I would say the tragedy, when we look at it from 30,000 feet, is that they had so many opportunities over the years to engage with that multilateral OSCE format, to have a more international involvement, including greater involvement from the United States and Europe. But Armenia and Azerbaijan didn't, for various domestic and historical reasons, weren't able to take that opportunity. And that's why conflict resolution at the moment has largely defaulted to Russia, and why we're talking about reviving the Minsk group. We're trying to find ways back in, but are very much Armenia and Azerbaijan's mutual intransigence, as it were, let the Russians be the dominant third power in that conflict.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Minsk group there, so I'll jump in with a question that we have from our audience. As you said, there's obviously intense interest in the region. We've got, I think, 455 people watching now across our channels, and we're getting in a lot of questions. So I'll try and pack in as many as I can. But staying with you for a second, Thomas, we have a question from Aram Avetsian from Voice of America, who asks, what is the future of the OSCE Minsk group?
Well, at the moment, it doesn't have much to do. And this was a group founded back in the 90s with the aim basically of resolving the unsolvable issue of the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. The Azerbaijanis are now in a dominant position and say that that issue is now off the table, that Nagorno-Karabakh as a concept no longer exists, and that there will be no autonomy for it. It's just a matter for the Armenians to accept their future within Azerbaijan in some shape or form. Clearly, the Armenians won't accept that, but as long as that's the dynamic, the Minsk group will really be working only at the edges of this conflict. And when it comes to the more current issues, in particular the opening of transport routes, it's very much the Russians who are at the center, and of course it's the Russians who are in there as peacekeepers, as a unilateral, basically, peacekeeper now on the ground. If we look at the longer term, clearly this conflict is not resolved, and at some point there will be some need for a return to multilateral diplomacy. But it's very much a matter of strategic patience, I think, of waiting for the parties to the conflict to come back to the Minsk group, to multilateral mechanisms, and decide that, of course, Russia will be there, but Russia may be within a larger format as well. But I think that will take a fair bit of time, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to bring in Ambassador Herbst now. I know you were listening along, Ambassador, to Deputy Assistant Secretary Olsen's remarks there. I'd just love to get your kind of your thoughts, your reaction to her comments, and whether you think, one thing that stood out to me was, you know, this idea of the US playing the role of the honest broker in the region. What potential do you see for that going forward?
Well, I think the US has been, relatively speaking, not active in the Caucasus. I mean, events over the past year and a half regarding outside powers has been driven by Turkey in the first instance and by Russia in the second. And I think Das Olsen's comments kind of reflect that. Her mentioning of a role, an honest broker role for the US, brings us back to the Minsk process. And of course, Minsk does play a role, but frankly, it's not a very prominent role, especially these days. And I think her comments were consistent with a relatively low-profile American approach to the region. It doesn't mean this will stay that way, but that's where we are.
I'd like to bring in Jason now. I mean, do you see any potential for cooperation between the Europe and the EU? I mean, we often see coordination between embassies with statements, but do you see potential for kind of wider and deeper coordination between Western powers in the South Caucasus?
I certainly do, and thank you, Amy, and thank you, Foreign Policy, for the opportunity to say this. Look, I think the most important question we can ask at this forum today is where the U.S. and the EU can take their combined influence to assist in the stabilization and the prosperity of this region. For 30 years, we've been advocating, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Olsen said, we've been advocating regional interconnectivity and cooperation because, I mean, frankly, when you've got three small states surrounded by giants, the best way for them to stand up on their own is for them to get on top of each other's backs and be a little bit bigger. And just this summer, the European Union and its Eastern Partnership Summit discussed a 2.3 billion euro investment in the region. And in fact, they're meeting again next week. So it'll be very interesting to hear what comes out of that. And if you combine that with the fact that the G7 this year announced in June that they have their own response to the Belt and Road Initiative, which may or may not prove to be a serious counter proposition, but I think even raising the idea of doing something shows that there's an appetite for cooperation among the liberal democracies on some kind of constructive policy response. I think there's a great deal that can be done. And I think as an American looking at the US relationship with the region, I'd say that the economic and the cultural dimensions are the most underdeveloped.
Mm-hmm. And just staying with you for a second, Jason, we've had a question in from the audience about, the EU's appetite for strategic autonomy. What implications do you think that has for the region?
Look, I mean, the United States and the European Union share values and interests in the region. I think, frankly, that it's instructive to look back 20 years to the U.S. appointment of Ambassador Richard Morningstar, who I believe is a colleague of Ambassador Herbst over at Atlantic Council now. He was tasked with the idea of helping materialize the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. It was an extraordinary success in many ways. I think that there's scope for the United States to make some sort of coordinative appointment of its various development agencies. We have a constellation of them. There's the DFC, of course, USAID. There's the Millennium Challenge Group. So somebody who could get out there and perhaps work with the Europeans to make sure that we achieve some synergy in our efforts in constructing something of an on-ramp to the Belt and Road Initiative, to give these countries a little bit of strategic flexibility.
And Thomas, coming back to you, I have to say we're getting some incredible audience questions today, so I'm going to let them do the talking for me. We have a question from William Primosh, who asked about Russia's willingness to allow Turkey to intervene quite so profoundly in the Armenia-Azerbaijan war by providing weapons to Azerbaijan. Russia's extremely sensitive about EU and US influence on its borders, but why didn't they push it? Did they push back against Turkey? If not, why not? And what's that dynamic like between Russia and Turkey in the region?
Well, of course, Russia and Turkey are traditional rivals in this region, and what we saw last year was a kind of strange flip back a century to what was happening, in the period of the end of the First World War, when Russia and Turkey were the great powers in the region, and suddenly Turkey was back a century later. I think that we have to attribute that to a shift in Azerbaijani policy to kind of move away from such strong reliance on Russia to choosing Turkey as its main ally, and they identified correctly, as it turned out, that Turkish military help could be the decisive factor in unfreezing that conflict in their favor. And so Russia, I think, wants to see more equilibrium. Russia has interest in both Armenia and Azerbaijan, which obviously gives Russia certain influence, but also is a constraining factor for Russia. They don't want to ruin their bilateral relationship with either country, whereas Turkey was very clear it was going to support Azerbaijan and use that war as it has as its kind of new entree back into the region and to many economic projects and connectivity projects and so on. But I think the other thing to say is that Russia and Turkey are kind of frenemies. They are rivals, but they also have a similar mindset, a similar authoritarian mindset, unfortunately, at the moment, and a similar, I think, interest in regional solutions rather than in multilateral solutions. So I think the challenge that the outside powers see is somehow to challenge this kind of condominium approach that Russia and Turkey have got. And in saying, I think, to countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan, do you really want these two strong neighbors with their own agendas to be the only ones there, or do you want some more honest brokers? But again, those honest brokers, and I guess this is the whole subject of the discussion today, have to have more to offer to these countries than they have in recent years.
Mm-hmm. What could, countries that could play that honest broker role, and what do they need to offer to expand their influence and kind of and play that role?
Well, if you're still asking me, I guess, obviously, we have to be honest. When it comes to Armenia, Azerbaijan, a bit less Georgia, the Western influence has definitely been diminished by the conflict. What have they got to offer? Well, I think the one thing is economic muscle, and to be a player by being a payer, as the European Union likes to say. They often worry that they're just the payer and not the player, but there are massive economic needs as a result of this, the aftermath of this conflict, reconstruction of Azerbaijani territories devastated by the Armenians, new road and rail connections to be built. If that's to come with a peace agenda, then you want to see European Union, United States, all the IFIs, World Bank, and so on, contributing to that, offering a big, massive, I think, economic package to this region to contribute to that and to do an extremely sophisticated reconstruction project, which also involves Georgia, connectivity, for example, between Armenia and Georgia. But to be the payers for that, but with a peace agenda rather than with a much more narrow national agenda. Now, obviously, they may make that offer and it could be turned down, but I think that's basically what the European Union and the United States have best to offer.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of ties in with what we heard earlier from Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Olson about, this request from partners for deeper engagement from the United States, particularly on regional coordination with things like trade and investment. Ambassador Herbst, I want to bring you in now. As we're seeing in the midst of this very dramatic Russian military buildup on the borders with Ukraine, Russia still has the ability and the willingness to use military might to spook its neighbors, if not invade them. Following the conflict last year between Azerbaijan and Armenia, we now have Russian boots on the ground in all three South Caucasus countries. I mean, to what extent are problems in the region solvable with Russia offside like that? And, is there a way that you see that Russia can become part of the solution rather than being at the core of some of the problems in the region?
Look, I'll answer that question. I just want to make one point about what's happened to date. Turkey enabled Azerbaijan to fix its problem in Nagorno-Karabakh and the other occupied territories of Azerbaijan by providing substantial military support. And in effect, Turkey stole a march on Moscow with that war. And Moscow recovered by then imposing a ceasefire after several unsuccessful attempts to impose a ceasefire, and putting their troops into Nagorno-Karabakh, you might say formally at the behest of the Armenians, but obviously also to ensure that Moscow was not eclipsed by Turkey's role. And the willingness of Turkey and Russia to play a part in the kinetic action is really the reason why they are the principal outside powers right now. Mm-hmm. And the US never saw it as in its interest to get involved at this level. And that may or may not have been a good decision, but that's where we are today. It is true that the changes as a result of the war and the imposed peace by Moscow, which was not a bad thing, by the way, might provide an opportunity for real regional cooperation. I say might because lots of things, difficult things would have to happen for that to be the case. One, I think that Ankara might be interested in this. In fact, they talk about this all the time. Baku also talks about this, partly in league with the Turks, but not just. And I think Ankara understands that the role it's played over the past 18 months is not one that the United States welcomed, and would like to use this as an issue to improve relations with us. And in fact, it would be good for the South Caucasus, all three countries, good for the United States, were it possible to agree on regional economic cooperation that Professor Gruda mentioned, and that Das Olson also kind of talked about. But for that to happen, two things are absolutely critical. One, does Armenia really want to get involved with this? There's a bruised political system or culture in Armenia right now because they had held the upper hand in the NK conflict up until last fall. and they still haven't quite come to grips with it. So it's not clear they'd be willing to participate in a regional economic effort that in theory should be in their interests. It's also true, I think, that Moscow would look at this as something where its interests are perhaps endangered. But certainly it would be in our interest and the EU's interest to develop a proposal for regional economic cooperation for this transportation corridor, which both Turkey and Azerbaijan are interested in. But we'd have to be willing to make a serious effort. It would be an effort not just with money, but also with high-level diplomatic engagement, in part to help persuade Armenia that this is in its interests, in part either to somehow pull Moscow along or at least block Moscow's ability to stop it. Certainly an incentive for the Armenians might be an open border and improve relations with Turkey. But again, there's lots of bruised psyches in Armenia right now, which would get in the way of this. And again, I think Moscow would not want to see this happen. So it would require a major effort where we'd have to use real capital, particularly in Moscow. Sorry for that wordy answer, but I want to get the whole point out.
No, well, it's a small region, but a complicated one. So thank you for that. Jason, I'd like to bring you in. You know, we've spoken a lot about the kind of the political and diplomatic dimensions of the great power politics at play in the South Caucasus, but I'm wondering, you know, could you talk a little bit about the kind of the economic and investment side of things? I mean, where are there opportunities for the United States and for the European Union to use that economic clout that Thomas mentioned earlier, to, you know, for greater regional integration, to build regional prosperity and peace?
Well, I agree with both of the other panelists that, you know, the end of this this war between Azerbaijan and Armenia does present potential possibility that we should try and seize. You know, we've been active, the United States and the Europeans, for 30 years in trying to promote this kind of interconnectivity that may be possible now. And I understand the concerns that Ambassador Herbst just suggested, but you know, I think given the opportunity, it's worth making an effort. Now, you know, there are a lot of projects. In fact, you know, infrastructure projects in the South Caucasus. It's many people have tried to tell the recent history of the South Caucasus through ethnopolitical conflict. You could just as easily argue that you can tell the recent geopolitical contestation history of the region through you know, roads, railroads, ports, and other infrastructure projects, pipelines proposed and constructed. So you know, there's a lot out there. You could find a marquee project. There was a lot of interest in the West in the Anaklia port project before that got shut down. I think the EU and the US were both very supportive of that. Secretary Pompeo even made a statement about it. And the US has also helped support reconditioning the port at Poti. You know, so I think that there are no lack of foci for cooperation between the EU and the US, and the moment is there. Now, one thing I would like to say, especially since I mentioned Ambassador Morningstar's efforts in the 1990s, it's important to recognize that a lot of the benefits from these infrastructure programs that have been pursued in the last 30 years have accrued to Georgia and Azerbaijan, and less so to Armenia. I think it's important that Armenia be brought in to the extent possible. It's frankly, if we're serious about building regional stability and building regional interconnectivity, I think an effort needs to be made.
Mm-hmm. I mean, staying with you for a moment, Jason, I mean, one country that we haven't yet really touched upon is, of course, China, which is making huge strides across the world with its Belt and Road Initiative. And we have had a question come in on that from Frank Fan, who asks, what are the South Caucasus states' position on the Belt and Road Initiatives, and what can the US offer, tangibly to compete against the influence of the Belt and Road?
Well, I think just as I was saying that the three states of the South Caucasus are greater together when they stand on each other's shoulders and have each other's backs. I think that it's equally true of the U.S. and the European Union, and I'm not convinced at all that there isn't a commonality of interest there and that to be explored. I don't know. I think it's easy to get perhaps overly concerned about what the Chinese are doing. These investments would make sense in the context of 30 years of US and EU policy towards the region, even if the Chinese weren't building the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's still about the commercial access of the United States and the EU into the region, as well as in assisting these countries in finding the stability and the ability to chart their own destinies. So, and I get a little frustrated with Americans who sort of look at the BRI and say, oh, we can't, what is this? What are we going to do? And throw up their hands. But, Tom was part of an excellent report on from Carnegie that gave I think a realistic assessment of where the BRI is really having more influence in Eastern Europe and where it's having less. And there is this G7 initiative, this Build Back Better World that was announced in June. We'll see what can be done in that context. And we'll see. I think it's important to see what the Europeans announce next week, but I hope that there's a dimension there for cooperation with the United States.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We've got time, I think, for one more audience question, which I will put to, I think, Thomas. What's your opinion on the Platform 6, which was proposed late last year by Erdogan and Aliyev?
Also known as the 3+3, which is the idea that the three regional powers and the three South Caucasus powers should be involved in a new kind of regional format. I don't think that's going to fly. I think for the reason that the Georgians simply won't buy into any initiative which excludes the European Union and the United States. For them, those are the two most important powers. Having said that, I think another thing that we haven't had time to discuss is the fact that EU-US influence in Georgia is also a bit diminished at the moment because of the way the current government is behaving and this escalating, polarizing row between the two main parties, the arrest of former President Saakashvili, who came back, and the fact that Georgia, I think this is a worrying development, really. Georgia's so sucked into its own domestic political crisis, that the clash of egos, the clash of these two main parties, that they're actually rejecting now fairly consistently the advice of the EU and the US. They've even rejected a 75 million euro loan from the EU in September because they wanted the government wanted to pursue its own appointments to the judiciary, contradicting European and American advice. Having said that, they're trying to push back against the EU and the US, but that doesn't mean, I don't think, that they're going to get any much closer to Russia or indeed China.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, I think we'll have to wrap up our panel. Thank you so much to all three of our panelists for joining us and sharing your insights today. I think we packed a lot into half an hour there, but we certainly could have kept going for much longer. This is clearly a complicated and multifaceted set of dynamics, and one that we will continue to cover here at Foreign Policy. Now, to round out our program for the day, we are honored to be joined by Mamuka Bakhtadze, the former Prime Minister of Georgia and now the chairman, oh, my slide just slipped off, the chairman of the America-Georgia Economic Cooperation Foundation. But first, I will pass the baton over to Andrew Solinger, our publisher, who will lead us into the next segment. Andrew, over to you.
Amy, thank you so much. What a fantastic discussion. In addition to a great discussion, I'm really impressed by all the questions we received from our audience. It is a large audience of several hundred across our platforms, but rarely do we see this level of all excellent questions. Very hard for you to choose which ones to pose. Good on you. And it really speaks to the complexities of the situation in the region and the opportunities. So thank you so much for guiding us through that discussion. I am indeed very excited to introduce our next guest, a geopolitical leader in the region who, although joining us from Washington, D.C. today, can share his on-the-ground perspective with us. So welcome to the virtual stage, Prime Minister Mamuka Baktadze. Please turn on your video and unmute and join me.
Thank you, Andrew. First of all, I would like to thank FP for organizing today's very informative and interesting event. And the panelists were discussing the events which are affecting the geopolitical dynamics in our region. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget about the geopolitical events that happen outside our region, but at the same time affect us. And of course, we are observing the negative trend that unfortunately the geopolitical turmoil and turbulence in the Black Sea region is growing, and therefore the uncertainties are growing. The unfolding of the situation in Afghanistan and everything that happened afterwards, including the energy crisis in Europe, brought a totally new geopolitical reality. And I think that this new geopolitical reality is more fragile and dangerous. But at the same time, I'm now in Washington, and I clearly feel and see the readiness of the policymakers here, as well as experts and think tanks who are working on these issues, to discuss what should be the response of the United States as a leader of the free world to these challenges, because these challenges are undermining the entire security architecture of the world. And these are the threats not only for Ukraine or for Georgia or for the other regional countries, but for entire world, I would say. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget to discuss other major topics as well. And I'm very happy that panelists, as well as Madam Deputy Assistant Secretary, brought the importance of economic cooperation, which I think is vital, especially now. Of course, we have some individual cases of a successful economic cooperation, which is really encouraging. But if you look at the statistics of FDI from the US in South Caucasus as well as in Central Asia, you can see a very negative trend. And unfortunately, someone may even say that we are observing the diminishing economic interests of American companies when it comes to their economic activities in our region. And of course, there are a number of reasons for that, but one of the major reasons, and all the researchers actually show this, that the American companies have a lack of financial and economic tools to compete with Asian companies and Russian companies. So basically, this was a reason, and also that was also one of my major goals as a Prime Minister of Georgia, to take the strategic partnership between US and Georgia to another level through economic cooperation. Because I clearly see that without a solid economic foundation, it will be extremely difficult to have a sustainable high-level political relations, because the weakness in the economic cooperation will be always used by negative forces to undermine the aspiration of the small countries, in this case of Georgia, and our aspirations to become part of EU and NATO. So therefore, I think that the economic dimension in our cooperation should be key. And I think that the current situation, although it is full of challenges, that may really open up some possibilities in this respect as well. And so that was a major motivation for me and for my American friends and Georgian friends to start this organization,
Yes,
America-Georgia Economic Cooperation Foundation, which basically will be promoting the idea of a very strong economic cooperation.
Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the America-Georgia Economic Cooperation Foundation now. What are your goals? What is your mission? What would you like to see happen?
So we have two major goals. The first is to promote and advocate an idea to have a DFC office in Georgia, which will cover South Caucasus and Central Asia. And the second goal is to advocate a free trade agreement between Georgia and the United States. We truly believe that both initiatives have a potential to entirely transform not only Georgia, but our region. And we have really very strong arguments to believe so. So let's take our first goal, right? DFC, the investment capacity of DFC is around 60 billion, which is 2 times more than OPEC used to have. So if some portion of that capacity will be allocated to our region, that would mean that American companies will have the economic sustainable tools to become again integrated into our part of the world. That would mean that the governments of the regional countries will have alternative sources to fund very critical infrastructure projects, and also the previous guest mentioned the problem of connectivity, because we to have integrate this part of the world with the global economy in a most efficient way. At the same time, it will be very important for the inclusive growth of those countries, because it will be a chance for small and medium enterprises to find American partners and start new businesses in the region. That would be a chance for the women entrepreneurs to get the financial resources for their business ideas. And also, what is very important from my perspective is that American business and American private sector can bring the high standards of labor right protection, the high standards of ecological standard protection. So innovations and technologies which will also motivate the governments to invest more in human capital development. So all this together will help us really to start another wave of transformation in the region, because I totally agree with the previous panelists that it's time to show the economic potential of the partnership between United States and our region. And of course, Georgia, who is a strategic partner of the United States, can and should have a special role in this.
Of course, and I think Thomas Dewell, in fact, all of the panelists, starting with the Deputy Assistant Secretary, were unanimous in the importance of that economic linkage and growth. But I love Thomas Dewell's description of economic and a geopolitical muscle. To be a player, you have to be a payer as well. And I do think it is important for those very specific relationships to be built. It's very clear that is critically important to the stability of the region. So that makes a tremendous amount of sense. We almost have to go, but I wanted to ask one last point about a very big virtual event that's taking place, another very big virtual event in addition to this one, taking place over the next couple of days, and that's the Summit for Democracy that President Biden is convening. And where there's hundreds of heads of state from around the world, some very interesting invitations, and some of them have been controversial. But a key invite, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Olson mentioned, is the President of Georgia. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that represents and what you, from your perspective, understand the thinking behind that might be.
As for the citizen of Georgia, that's again, for me, is a very strong message from the United States that United States believe in democratic potential of Georgia and is supporting our aspirations to become part of Euro-Atlantic community, which is the major goal, I would say, of Georgia, and I would say even of my generation as well. So participation of Georgia in this summit is really encouraging for me, and I'm sure for all the citizens of Georgia.
I think it's fantastic to see and to hear the encouraging signs that we hear about Georgia from you, from our panelists, from the Deputy Assistant Secretary. It's very heartening, and it's really interesting to and heartening to hear the interest level from our audience, from the FP audience in this topic and issue. So I thank you so much for convening all of us and bringing us all together for really what was a great discussion. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much, Mamuka.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, and thank FP and your team for organizing this event. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So unfortunately, we will have to end it here. That was Mamuka Baktadze, the head of the AGECF, a very important new foundation, think tank, and NGO in Georgia and the region. And we really appreciate his partnership on this discussion, really great discussion. To all of our presenters, it's been a pleasure to hear from you all. Thank you so much for joining us to share your perspectives. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in. As mentioned, you were very engaged, which was really rewarding for us. So a full recording of this event will be available shortly on FP's event page. And there's more to come from FP next week. On December 16th, you can tune in for a very timely and thought-provoking FP virtual dialogue on how to end vaccine apartheid, brought to you by Brand South Africa. We will tackle questions concerning vaccine nationalism, a lack of effective global cooperation, and stymied attempts to lower the cost of production and distribution of vaccines to help ensure equitable access to vaccines across the globe. You can register for this and other upcoming events at foreignpolicy.com/events. And if you don't already, please support FP and our programming by subscribing to FP. To help encourage you, I am happy to offer you a 20% discount code right now. Simply go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and enter the code EVENTSFP, EVENTSFP, for your discount. We very much appreciate your support. Take care and see you soon.